Wonderful. I want to welcome everyone to a new academic year of programming here at the Kelsey Museum. We're kicking things off today with our First Friday Flash Talk, um, breaking, sorry, I'm letting people in. With our First Friday Flash Talk, Breaking Bronze for Demeter, identifying indigenous religious practices in Archaic Greek Sicily, presented by IPAMAA student Alex Moskowitz. As always, our Flash Talks are 15-minute Zoom lectures by Kelsey curators, staff, members, researchers, graduate students, guests, all talking about current and relevant research. So once the presentation is over, we will open up the floor to you, our audience, for 15 minutes of Q&A. So without further ado, I will turn it over to Alex.
Great. Okay, give
Thank
me
you.
one sec, and I can share my screen. Been a while since we did Zoom. Okay. Can everyone see that? Great. Great. Well, thanks so much for having me, Stephanie, and for inviting me to do this. It's fun to get to talk to you all, and thanks to all of you for taking time out of your Fridays to listen to me drone. So what I'm going to be talking about today is just a little portion of my ongoing dissertation work. My dissertation is focused on the archaeology of communities in Sicily between 1000 and 500 BCE, where I use metal and metallurgy and the uses of metals in society as a lens to understand how populations developed and changed during this period, which was marked by kind of mass migrations and colonization. So this is just a sort of small section of that work. So the argument, just to give just so we all start off in this kind of same spot, is that Demeter worship in Greek Sicily developed from indigenous traditions in Sicily, and that thinking about how it developed from those traditions helps us to have a kind of clearer understanding of the various ways that Greeks and indigenous populations interacted beyond kind of the traditional narratives that we get from our literary sources. So there are 2 points of background before we dive into this. The first is to introduce all of us to the concept of Greek colonization. So Sicily, which is the focus of my research in this talk, was one of the sort of first and biggest destinations for Greek colonization during the Archaic period. Sicily right here alongside Magna Graecia and over here Pithecusae were some of the earliest sites of colonization. So people started arriving in Pithecusae, in Syracuse, and Naxos, and down the coast of Sicily, and over here in the late 8th century BC, so like 730 BCE, we can say. And the narratives that we get from this are that Greeks and Phoenicians, people of modern day Lebanon, migrated out west, right? And they settled in Sicily and South Italy. They settled up in the Black Sea. They settled in southern France and southern Spain, northern Africa. And this process is responsible for a lot of major cities that we know of today, right? Marseille was founded by the Greeks, supposedly, and Carthage in modern Tunisia was a Phoenician foundation, and all over Sicily, some of the biggest cities in Sicily today, Agrigento, Syracuse, were initially founded by in this period of settlement. So one of the sort of biggest things that our literary sources say about this process is that oftentimes, and this is a narrative that's mostly passed down by Thucydides, is that Greeks arrived in Sicily, and in the process of arriving in Sicily, They usually conquered, forcibly ejected, or enslaved the indigenous populations. And this is a narrative that's written 200 years after the fact by the Greeks, right? So it's not quite clear if that's a really accurate reflection of what happened or not. And a lot of research, a lot of archaeological work that's been done in the past 30 years in Sicily has been focused on reevaluating these narratives, providing sort of hard evidence from this sort of exact time period to understand how these cultural processes took place and whether things were as one-sided as our literary sources would have us believe. And turns out they're not, right? It's not nearly as one-sided, and there was a lot more collaboration and a lot more variability to this process. Um, and the second sort of major point of background is that Sicily is famous for its relationship to Demeter and Persephone and the worship of the goddesses. Here you see some coins from the city of Morgantina with a little grain on them. Sicily is incredibly agriculturally abundant, right? It's very fertile. It produces a lot of agriculture. So the connection to Demeter is not really surprising. And our literary sources reflect this. Diodorus Siculus says that as far as you can go back in time, basically, Demeter and Persephone have been sacred to the island, right? But Demeter and Persephone are Greek gods, right? And as far as you go back in time, there haven't been Greeks always in Sicily, right? So there's a connection. There's a question here about what does the origins of Demeter and Persephone worship in Sicily look like, and what instigates this process, right? So with that, we can sort of turn to think about the matter at hand. So my dissertation project started out like a lot of projects do. I was lucky enough to get some funding in order to do a road trip, right, basically, and to spend a year in Sicily doing research and traveling around the island. And as I was driving from site to site, visiting museums, I noticed something of a pattern that was really interesting to me. So most sites of Demeter worship contain a pretty standardized set of offerings. What you're looking at right here is a offering, a votive deposit from a sanctuary of Demeter from around the 7th or 6th century, probably 6th century, late 6th century, from the site of Halorus, which is just south of modern day Syracuse. And you can see there are terracotta figurines, there are these small little drinking vessels and eating vessels, and there are lamps. And these are sort of the most common things that you dedicate to Demeter. It's part of this ritual, this festival called the Thesmophoria, which is a 3-day festival where there's a lot of eating and feasting, and then you bury everything at the end. But as I was driving around, and this sort of ritual is pretty standardized across Sicily, so goes the saying, so goes our conventional thoughts. But as I was driving around Sicily, I started noticing at a couple sites that there were weird things in some of these votive deposits. So here at the site of Eknomos, which is modern day Licata, I was visiting the museum and I saw this very large bronze ingot, right? We call it a plano-convex ingot. You can just call it an ingot. And it was broken into a bunch of pieces and it was deposited alongside with this wide-faced chisel that you see right here. And then I kept driving around and I got up to the site of Agrigento. And at the museum in Agrigento, I found they had on display this large pithos, which is a huge ceramic vessel used for storage, and it's made in an indigenous Sicilian style, right? Those decorations are not conventionally Greek. And it was filled with huge chunks of bronze, right? There are 150 kilograms of bronze inside this pithos. And this was also dedicated in a sanctuary to Demeter. And when I looked into the explanation of these pithoi, and these sort of depositions of bronze, the most common explanation was that the bronze was maybe offered for its monetary value, or as some kind of resource, return of resources to the earth, right? You know, you mine metals, you use them, and then you give them back. And who better to give them back to than Demeter, who's the sort of goddess of both kind of the subterranean, right, and the earth itself, and Persephone, of course, actual wife of Hades. Um, So when I got back to my desk and I started looking into these collections of bronze at sanctuaries to Demeter and Persephone in Sicily, I started looking for comparanda, and what I found was that there was a pretty long history in Sicily of dedicating or burying large collections of bronze ingots and spearheads and other objects in Sicily that dedicate back to at least the 13th century BCE, the Sicilian Late Bronze Age, and that this comes from a tradition they're often referred to as hoards, bronze hoards. And in Sicily, these hoards are often fragmented. They're sort of ritually broken into pieces, and that archaeologists have often talked about the sort of tradition, the indigenous tradition of breaking bronze into pieces, but they haven't quite thought about how to connect that to religion more broadly. And it seems to be a particularly explicit indigenous tradition. And one of the things that I'm doing in my dissertation research is trying to understand how indigenous religious traditions connect to Greek religious traditions, right? So this is a really fruitful opportunity to think about that kind of connection because we have all of these indigenous sites where we have these fragmented bronze hoards, and then we have all these sort of conventionally understood Greek sites where we have the same kinds of bronze hoards, right? That are broken. They look a little different, but the same practice is there, right? You dedicate huge amounts of bronze, and the bronze is broken up into bits, kind of very methodically. So I can give you a sense of what these hoards look like, right? The hoard from Mendelito di Adrano, which is on the hill on Etna, on the slopes of Etna, is the biggest hoard that we know of. It was dedicated in the 7th century BCE, so after the arrival of the first Greeks, and it contains over 900 kilograms of bronze, right? It's a massive, massive collection of bronze, and it's mostly these plano-convex ingots, right? Alongside spearheads and bronze vessels and other things. And you can see here that these bronze spearheads are broken, right? They're really precisely broken into pieces. And you see the same thing happens with these bronze ingots. And another thing that happens in these hoards, and this is from Lipari, which is an island just off the coast of Sicily to the north, is that they melt down bronze. They melt down objects to create these ingots, right? So they take old stuff and they melt it down to create an ingot. And then oftentimes they take that ingot that they just made and they break it into pieces. So here you can see some stuff that was melted down, but it wasn't quite fully melted down, right? So you've got a spearhead here and another one there. You've got some wire and stuff an axe head, and all of this stuff came from the same hoard where they were melting things down to recycle it, and then they broke it into pieces and they deposited it as a dedication of some form. So, looking at all this evidence from hoards together, we find that these hoards come in general from sanctuaries that we think are dedicated to chthonic deities, right? They're dedicated to deities that are underground subterranean gods that are responsible for sort of guaranteeing fertility, right? That's the conventional understanding of the sanctuaries where we find these hoards at Sabattina, at Monte Casale Giratana, and at Mendelita di Adrano, right? And it's the same thing is true of our sites in Greek colonies, right? At Agrigento, at Licata, at Gela, and at Heloros. These are chthonic deities. That's what Demeter and Persephone are. They're underground deities, right, that are responsible for fertility. So we have a trend in evidence across time that seems to suggest that breaking bronze in Sicily and dedicating it to chthonic deities begins in the 13th century and continues all the way into these sort of earliest levels of these Greek sanctuaries to Demeter and Persephone. And to complement this kind of evidence, we can look at the sort of site really briefly of Monte Roveto, where we have a hoard. We have two hoards. And right inside the sort of sanctuary space, archaeologists found a casting mold for making one of these big bronze plano-convex ingots, right? So just like the ingot that we saw at Mendelito di Adrano, they produce these things here and then they deposit them as a dedication to the deity, right? They break them sometimes and they deposit them as a dedication to the deity. And if we look across all of these assemblages across all of Sicily, from 700 to 500 BC, right, which is right when these Greek colonies start popping up and when they start building their first sort of religious spaces. We see that there's a trend in that these colonies include these hoarding sites always have ingots and they always have broken objects, right? They take their ingots and they break them into pieces. So the ritual or the process, the practice that this seems to be that we seem to have the most evidence from these assemblages is that they dedicate these materials, but first, before they dedicate them, they break them into pieces. And the common sort of explanation for this is that they're defunctionalizing them, right? They're taking them out of the ways that they could have been used, and instead because they've been broken, they're no longer usable, and as such are suitable dedications to the gods. And this is particularly concentrated, right, in this sort of south central area in Sicily. And these deposits take a bunch of different forms, but they all have the same consistent kind of set of things that are included. And together, right, we can start thinking about what the influence that these hordes might have had on the origins of Greek religious practice, right? Because these hordes start popping up at the very earliest levels of our earliest sanctuaries to Demeter and Persephone in Sicily, right? So at Agrigento, which was founded around 598 BC, the sort of beginning of the 6th century BC, as soon as it was founded, it seems to have established a small sanctuary temena, a small sanctuary space to Demeter and Persephone at the site of Sant'Anna. And at Sant'Anna, they created this sort of structure. And inside the structure, this pithos was put down, right? This pithos that we've already talked about. So the pithos was right here at the inside of the structure. And then the structure was surrounded with votive deposits like we saw at Halloris at the start of the lecture, sort of conventional votive deposits. But the very beginnings of the structure are with this sort of dedication of bronze. So it seems to be some kind of connection between old traditions of venerating sort of subterranean deities and the sort of new Greek traditions around how to venerate subterranean deities, right? So the instigation, though, for this tradition is indigenous practices that have conventionally happened in this region. And this practice disappears over time, right? Hoarding by the end of the 6th century really goes away. We don't see it very often. But there are elements of it that continue kind of far later than we conventionally imagine indigenous culture persists in Sicily, right? You often hear people say that sort of the Sicels and the Sicans, the indigenous populations of Sicily, were basically gone by the 5th century. But at Bidelemi, which is one of our largest sanctuaries to Demeter and Persephone, it's outside the Greek colony of Gela, in southern Sicily. You find they continue to deposit single pieces of bronze in their deposits, right? That are mixed with their sort of regular objects, including terracotta figurines, lamps, and small drinking vessels. They continue to dedicate single pieces of bronze late into the 5th century, right? So way after we've imagined these communities have stopped sort of really having a stronghold in Greek communities, the traditions, right, that sort of define how they worship subterranean gods seem to persist. So there's an indication here that indigenous communities might have had a role not just in instigating Demeter worship in Sicily, but on influencing what it looks like and how it takes place for a pretty long period of time after we sort of conventionally give them that kind of agency. So that's just a quick look at the kind of research that I'm doing right now. I know is a little summary, so if you have any questions about what these kind of sanctuaries look like, how this process takes place, or what the sort of temporal boundaries are of it, I'd be happy to talk about them in the question and answer.
Thank you so much, Alex. So now I would encourage any of you to unmute yourselves. Feel free to ask questions and let's have a conversation about Alex's research. You can also throw your questions in the chat and I can read those as well.
Hi, it's Mary. I was just wondering, did the Greeks record name for those indigenous groups?
So we have the names of the sort of Sicilian indigenous communities. On the eastern coast of Sicily, they were the Sicels. The sort of central Sicilian communities were called the Sicans, the Sicani, and on the west coast, they were the Elemians. But those ethnic categories, it's always hard to understand what exactly the boundaries are, if that's a name that was assigned to them by the Greeks, or if it was a name that they called themselves. But the conventional names are the Sicans in the east, the Sicels in the east, the Sicani in the center, and the Elemians in the west.
Thank you.
Yeah.
And you also said that many of them were either enslaved or banished. Was it from the enslaved people that their culture influenced the Greeks, perhaps? Or
So it's hard to say. I think that it's likely that not nearly as many of them were sort of enslaved or banished as we initially sort of imagined, but instead that after the sort of Greeks started arriving on the island, that there might have been sort of mutual participation in establishing settlements. So I think one thing that seems quite likely, especially at a site like Agrigento, where you have sort of worship in an indigenous style taking place at the very beginning of the sanctuary, it seems like those communities probably had a much bigger role in that society and a lot more agency than you would imagine that an enslaved population would have. And instead, they're probably equal participants in the community. And the same thing could be said for Gala. And that changes over time, right? In the late sixth century, Greeks start getting very touchy about their identity in comparison to the barbarians, right? The people around them. And they start being a lot less sort of open, at least in terms of their literary descriptions of other communities. But I think in the 8th and 7th centuries, I mean, the Greeks were a small population moving onto an island that had that was already populated. So I don't think that they could have exerted that kind of force that early.
so the influence was more at the beginning and mutual.
Yeah. I think at the beginning it was more mutual, and over time things changed, right? As sort of Greek identity developed in a different direction. But in the beginning stages, I think it was much more a sort of small scale populations intermingling. It seems to be a better way of explaining the phenomenon, than thinking about it in terms of colonization, like we tend to think about sort of modern colonization. I don't think a sort of modern colonial lens is quite as applicable in this context. Yeah. So it's not like a England, British colonization of India or the United States or America, but something else.
And you said it might have had monetary value, but this was before they started making coins, for
Yeah,
example.
yeah. So coinage starts in the sixth century, in the late sixth century. I think, yeah, in the sixth century. But we see these practices beginning long before that, right? Because even though they weren't minting coinage, bronze had exchange value, right? And metals were one of the major reasons that Greeks and Phoenicians ended up sort of expanding into the Mediterranean more broadly, the sort of need to acquire tin and copper, silver and other metals was a sort of major driver of the sort of expansion of these communities, and a driver of sort of economic interactions. So they didn't have coins just yet, but they definitely had a sense of value, right? Material value.
Well, they may have had priests of sorts at that time, or was this by the common people?
Um, so we don't really know, right? That's a hard question to answer. Um, it, some of these communities probably weren't at the scale that they would have like a full-time priest, and instead it might have been a little bit more like
Community.
at the moment, right? Somebody serves as that when they're called upon to do it, but otherwise they're mostly just a farmer. But it's hard to say. I think early on in these sort of small scale communities, because at the moment of their foundation, right, a lot of these communities were quite small. Talking hundreds of people rather than thousands. So you can't quite have like a professional priestly class. And instead, they'd be sort of taken from the population. It'd be a role that they perform temporarily.
Thanks so much. Does anyone else have any other questions? Feel free to go ahead and unmute yourself or throw them in the chat.
Yeah, I have a question.
Sure.
Do you have any indication, or if not, do you have any hunches about whether these dedications of medals were being given by individuals or by the community sort of as a whole, and what might the implications of those be for sort of understanding identity?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. And actually so this map that I've been showing you repeatedly has hoards and deposits labeled, right? And this actually addresses that. So hoards are singular deposits. There's a single very large deposit and a single very large assemblage of bronze, right? At Mendelito, we have 900 kilograms. At Graham McKelle, there's 700 kilograms. These are massive collections of bronze. And at these sanctuaries down here, right, where you see these red rhombuses, you have deposits, what I call deposits, which are much smaller, right? They contain 5 kilograms of bronze or 10 kilograms of bronze. So I'm working through it still, but I think what's happening is that the earlier periods, the sort of origins of this tradition are in communal dedication, right? It's a community dedication. And then as it sort of gets adopted into these sort of new religious contexts, and as the sort of 6th century starts taking over and demonstrations of status become more important, it becomes an individualized process, right? Where individuals will dedicate these things because they're trying to make statements about status and identity, as opposed to dedicating things as part of sort of a broader community. And I think that's also a little bit of fitting into Greek systems of practice. Because conventional thesmophoriae are not giant communal depositions, but small scattered depositions. So as these communities sort of instigate Demetriac worship, the Greeks add something to the way the practice operates, just as the sort of indigenous communities add their own rituals. So it's a kind of negotiated practice. So I think in the Greek communities, we should imagine them being individualized or at least family-based depositions rather than whole community deposits.
Great, thank you. Any other questions? So Alex, do you have any lingering questions on your research? Like any next steps that you're thinking?
Always. Yeah. So I mean there are plenty of other questions and other directions that I'm taking this in. I mean, I think one of the sort of biggest things is if we look over here, we see this unbolded text, and these are unpublished or underpublished sites. So that would be a good direction to get some of this data published, to be able to sort of look at things a little bit more carefully. But for the most part, as I'm sort of working on my dissertation, my research has progressed in other directions, and I'm thinking about some other stuff. But I think one thing, or a sort of final thing that would be really useful to think about, is we see this sort of clustering in this area. And I'd like to expand my research a little bit more into Western Sicily, to think about whether or not this process was occurring in Western Sicily. And the evidence isn't well published there. It's even harder to find data in the West. But I think it's likely that we see the same kind of processes. It's just a little harder to get access to it. A lot of this sort of Sicilian archaeological evidence is published in very small journals, or that are pretty hard to find. Or they were never published, and you have to find them in a museum, which is the case for a lot of this stuff. But I do intend to get back to it and look at it a little bit more then.
Wow, thank you. Well, I hope you're able to do that.
Fingers crossed.
Anyone else have additional questions? Well, as always, Alex has his email address at the end of this presentation. If you think of a question and want to email him, feel free to do that. It's there on your screen. Thank you, Alex. So we will wrap up today. I want to just thank Alex for sharing his research with us. This was incredibly interesting. Thank you so much. And as always, thank you all for your questions and participation and for joining us. So this academic year, we'll have 2 flash talks per month. So our next one will be September 25th. So keep an eye out for that. As always, go to our homepage to look at our upcoming events. Thank you so much, all, and I hope you have a great weekend.